Have you ever felt like there's something more? Something just beyond the edge of what you can see, hear, or touch? Those moments when you sense a presence in the room, or a strange feeling in your chest when everything around you goes silent. It's as if the world pulls back its curtain for a brief second, and you catch a glimpse of something ancient, something eternal. In every culture, in every era, humans have whispered about these moments. They've called them signs, omens, visions, or miracles. And in Buddhism, they are known as spiritual phenomena. Stories speak of monks who could walk upon water, read minds, or even recall countless past lives as easily as remembering what they ate for breakfast. There are tales of radiant lights appearing during deep meditation, of visions of distant realms, and of those rare moments when the mind slips beyond the ordinary into a space that feels like touching infinity itself. But here's the question that matters. Should we believe them? Are these genuine glimpses into deeper layers of existence? Or are they beautiful illusions born from a restless mind seeking meaning? You see, the Buddha himself spoke of such things. He acknowledged them, but he also left a gentle warning. Spiritual phenomena are not the treasure. They're the glittering pebbles you might find on the road. And if you spend too long gathering pebbles, you might forget where you were going. Because in Buddhism, the ultimate goal isn't to chase miracles. It's to awaken, to see reality clearly, to free yourself from suffering. And yet, these stories endure, not because they promise magic, but because they whisper of possibility, that maybe, just maybe, there's more to this life than what meets the eye. So here we are, at the doorway of a subject both fascinating and controversial. Over the next chapters, we'll step inside this world. We'll unravel ancient teachings, hear timeless stories, and look beyond superstition to find the deeper wisdom hiding within. This isn't about blind faith. It's about curiosity. It's about understanding. And perhaps, learning how to walk the fine line between wonder and wisdom. Let's begin. When you hear the words spiritual phenomena, what comes to mind? A ghostly figure in a darkened room, a dream so vivid it feels like a message from beyond, or perhaps the sensation that you've lived this exact moment before. These experiences capture our imagination because they hint at something more, a world layered beneath the one we can measure, a current moving beneath the surface of everyday life. And in the Buddhist tradition, these phenomena aren't dismissed as fantasy. They're recognized, categorized, and most importantly, understood within the context of the mind. The ancient texts speak of what are known as idai, supernormal powers that may arise through deep concentration and insight. They aren't magic tricks or supernatural gifts handed down by divine beings. They're natural abilities of the mind unlocked through disciplined practice. Imagine your mind as a still lake. When the surface is calm, it reflects the world perfectly. And in that clarity, extraordinary things can happen. Stories tell of monks who, through intense meditation, developed abilities like recollection of past lives, clairvoyance, seeing distant events, clairaudience, hearing sounds from other realms, and even the ability to walk through walls or appear in multiple places at once. But here's the secret few ever speak of. These powers aren't meant to impress. They're not party tricks for the spiritually curious. In Buddhism, they serve a purpose: to deepen one's understanding of impermanence, suffering, and the non-self. To remind the practitioner that even the miraculous is, in the end, empty of lasting substance. Beyond these idai, there are subtler phenomena too. The sudden sensation of being watched in an empty room. A message received in a dream that alters the course of your life. A moment in meditation where your sense of body and self dissolves into pure awareness. Are these illusions? Are they signs? In Buddhism, the answer is nuanced. The mind is infinitely creative. It can conjure landscapes, beings, and entire realities within itself. But not everything born in the mind is a deception. Some experiences, especially in profound states of stillness, may reveal insights about the nature of reality itself. Not in the way of predicting lottery numbers or seeing ghosts, but in recognizing how fluid, interconnected, and impermanent this life truly is. It's important to understand that these phenomena are byproducts, not the goal. Like flowers blooming along the path, beautiful, yes, but not where the road ultimately leads. The Buddha himself acknowledged these abilities. He neither denied them nor glorified them. In fact, he taught that while they might arise, a wise practitioner should neither cling to them nor build their identity around them. Because every experience, no matter how vivid or otherworldly, is conditioned, temporary, and ultimately subject to decay. So when we ask, what are spiritual phenomena in Buddhism? The answer is this: they're natural capacities of the mind, sometimes profound, sometimes misleading, always impermanent, and like everything else, they too must be let go of. Yet the question remains: if these experiences are real, how should we relate to them? Should we chase them, fear them, or simply observe them as they pass? To uncover this, we'll need to look a little deeper at how Buddhist masters throughout history have approached the miraculous. In a world brimming with mysteries, where the unseen often stirs both fascination and fear, it's easy to fall into the trap of blind belief, to accept the unexplained without question, to be dazzled by stories of miracles, spirits, and cosmic signs, never stopping to ask, is this true? And even if it is, does it matter? The Buddha, long before modern science or psychology, saw this tendency in the human heart. And instead of fanning the flames of superstition, he offered something far more valuable, not blind faith, but wisdom. In the ancient town of Kesaputta, a group known as the Kalamas once approached the Buddha with a dilemma. They were surrounded by countless teachers and doctrines, each claiming to hold the ultimate truth, each promising salvation, enlightenment, or divine favor, if only one would believe without question. The Kalamas were confused, overwhelmed, and so they asked the Buddha, who should we believe? Whose word should we take as true? The Buddha's reply was not what anyone expected. He didn't declare himself the ultimate authority. He didn't urge them to follow him blindly. Instead, he said, "Do not go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or by the thought. This contemplative is our teacher. Test things for yourself. See what leads to peace, to clarity, to the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. Follow that." This was revolutionary, a spiritual path grounded not in obedience but in direct experience. In Buddhism, it isn't enough to hear about something or read it in a sacred text. You must verify it through your own heart, your own mind, your own life. Even spiritual phenomena, the visions, the signs, the otherworldly experiences must be questioned, observed, and ultimately understood as part of the mind's vast and mysterious landscape. The Buddha taught that clinging to these experiences, or worse, building one's identity around them, was just another form of attachment. And attachment is the root of suffering. Whether it's a material possession, a relationship, or a shimmering vision of a radiant deity, the principle remains the same. If you cling, you suffer. This is why the Buddha placed wisdom above blind faith. He saw how easily the human mind could be enchanted by the extraordinary, but also how quickly that enchantment could become a trap. It's not that spiritual phenomena aren't real, or that they don't happen. It's that their value lies not in their spectacle, but in what they reveal about the nature of mind, of impermanence, of self. And if we mistake the signpost for the destination, we risk wandering endlessly, chasing after fleeting lights. The true miracle, according to the Buddha, isn't walking on water or recalling past lives. It's transforming the heart. It's turning greed into generosity, hatred into compassion, delusion into wisdom. Because what use is seeing 1,000 heavens if we can't find peace in this very moment? What value is hearing celestial voices if we still can't listen to the suffering of a friend? This is the teaching. This is the path. Wisdom over blind faith. And yet the stories persist. The tales of visions, voices, and mysteries beyond imagining. So how should we approach them? Ignore them entirely? Or see if, hidden beneath the layers of wonder and myth, there might still be something worth understanding? To find out, we need to turn to the masters, those ancient practitioners who walked this path before us, and see how they met the miraculous, with clear eyes, steady hearts, and unwavering wisdom. If you've ever sat in stillness in the quiet of your own breath, beneath a canopy of stars, or in a silent room with only the pulse of your heart for company, you'll know. The mind is not a tame thing. It stirs, it wanders, it remembers, it imagines, and sometimes it reveals. From ancient times, meditators have spoken of strange visions, lights that appear in the darkness, voices with no speaker, vivid memories of other lives, or journeys to realms unseen by ordinary eyes. But where do these experiences come from? Are they messages from beyond, or echoes of something far closer, something within? In Buddhist understanding, there are two powerful forces behind these experiences: meditation and karma. And together, they weave a fascinating story about the nature of our inner world. Let's begin with meditation. When you sit in deep concentration, especially through practices like jhana, profound states of mental absorption, the mind becomes incredibly refined. The noise of ordinary thought quiets, the senses withdraw, and what remains is a vast, open awareness, clear like a still mountain lake. In this stillness, impressions rise. Some are old, forgotten memories, unprocessed emotions. Others are symbolic images born of the subconscious, shaped by your culture, your hopes, your fears. And then there are those that feel otherworldly. Visions of radiant beings, sensations of floating, even glimpses of other lives. But the Buddha warned, not every light is a star, not every vision is truth. The mind, in its complexity, can conjure wonders far beyond what we realize. And these visions are neither inherently good nor bad. They're simply phenomena, arising, passing. The danger lies in becoming attached to them. Now, to karma. In Buddhist thought, karma isn't just about moral cause and effect. It's also the shaping force of our consciousness. Every intentional thought, word, and action plants a seed. And over lifetimes, these seeds ripen. Some of them ripen in the form of spiritual experiences. A meditator who once practiced deep devotion in past lives might now, effortlessly, experience visions of celestial beings. Another who sought knowledge might suddenly recall details from ancient times. These aren't random. They're the unfolding of accumulated tendencies, karmic echoes, surfacing in the silence of meditation. And this is why two people, sitting side by side in the same monastery on the same cushion, practicing the same technique, might have vastly different experiences. One sees lights. One feels deep peace. One recalls a childhood memory. One experiences nothing at all, because each mind carries its own history. The Buddha, with his deep insight, saw both the beauty and the danger in this. He encouraged meditators to acknowledge these phenomena, but not to cling to them, not to build pride or fear around them, because even the most radiant vision is impermanent. Even the most extraordinary experience will fade. The true aim of meditation isn't to chase after mystical sights or psychic powers. It's to see clearly, to understand the nature of reality, to uproot greed, hatred, and delusion. And while spiritual experiences can sometimes act as signposts, hinting that the mind is growing subtler, more receptive, they're not the final destination. It's like walking a mountain trail at dawn. Sometimes the mist clears and you glimpse distant peaks, beautiful, awe-inspiring, but you don't abandon your path to chase the mist. You keep walking, step by step, knowing that the true treasure isn't a fleeting view, but the summit itself. So it is with meditation. Spiritual experiences arise from deep stillness, from the ripening of old karma, and from the natural capacities of the mind itself. But the wise practitioner neither clings to them nor fears them. They observe, they learn, and they let go. And yet, In temples and forest monasteries across Asia, old stories linger of masters who, through years, belief is a powerful thing. It can lift us beyond despair, guide us through darkness, and open our hearts to mysteries greater than ourselves. For countless people across centuries, belief in spiritual phenomena has done just that. The tales of radiant beings, unseen guardians, and messages from beyond have soothed the grieving, strengthened the faithful, and given hope to the weary. But like all powerful forces, belief can heal, or it can harm. It can open doors, or it can blind us. Tonight, let's look closely at this double-edged sword. To begin with, the benefits. When someone believes in the existence of spiritual phenomena, it often cultivates a sense of humility, a quiet reminder that life is far bigger, deeper, and more mysterious than what we can touch or measure. For many, this belief fosters compassion. Because if unseen realms exist, if karma carries across lives, then every word, every action, every thought matters. And when people believe in guardian spirits or protective forces, it can offer profound comfort in moments of grief or fear. Consider a mother mourning the loss of her child. The belief that her child's spirit lives on, or that kind beings watch over them, can be the thread that holds her heart together. For a traveler lost in danger, the faith in unseen protection can give the courage to take one more step. And for the elderly facing death, visions of peaceful realms offer solace that this life is not the end. In these ways, belief in spiritual phenomena serves a vital psychological and emotional role. It's medicine for the heart. But there is a shadow side. When belief becomes blind, when it loses its anchor in wisdom, it can turn dangerous. History, both ancient and recent, is filled with tragedies born from unexamined faith. People have been exploited by those claiming special powers, manipulated by charlatans pretending to channel spirits or predict futures. At times, entire communities have been led astray, chasing after miracles while neglecting the true path of inner cultivation. And even well-meaning believers can fall into traps, becoming obsessed with signs and omens, reading too much into dreams or coincidences, letting fear or superstition dictate their decisions. The Buddha saw this clearly. He warned against clinging to phenomena, not because they weren't real, but because they could easily distract the mind from what truly matters. He taught that while spiritual experiences can be meaningful, they are not the goal. Wisdom is. Freedom from suffering is. And these are found not in chasing signs, but in understanding the nature of the mind itself. Buddhist texts describe monks and nuns who, after experiencing miraculous visions or powers, became proud. Some clung to those experiences, believing themselves superior. Others feared losing them and grew anxious. Both states, pride and fear, became obstacles on their path. It's not the experience itself that causes trouble. It's the attachment to it, and the belief that these fleeting, conditioned phenomena hold ultimate truth. There's a famous analogy in the Buddhist tradition. Imagine a man who comes across a beautiful lotus flower floating on a pond. Its colors are radiant, its fragrance sweet. He marvels at it, and in his joy, he forgets where he was going. He spends his days gazing at the flower, believing he has found life's greatest treasure. But the pond is shallow, and beyond it lies an ancient forest, and within that forest, a hidden path to freedom. This, the Buddha said, is what happens to those who fixate on spiritual phenomena. The visions, the signs, the miraculous are like the lotus flower. Beautiful, yes, but if you stop there, you miss the deeper journey. So should one believe in spiritual phenomena? It depends. If that belief softens your heart, inspires your practice, and reminds you of the unseen mysteries of existence, let it be a gentle companion on your path. But if it becomes a chain, a source of pride, fear, or superstition, let it go. The wise neither cling to nor deny these things. They acknowledge them as natural parts of the vast unfolding of mind and karma. They honor the mystery, but stay rooted in wisdom. Because in the end, it's not what visions you see or signs you receive that define your freedom. It's how clearly you see reality itself. Across the ancient monasteries and hidden mountain retreats, the old teachers understood this well. Some spoke openly of their visions, others kept silent, but all agreed on one thing. The path is not in the sky, not in the miracles, but in the heart. And this brings us to a timeless question, one that seekers in every age have wrestled with. How do we balance faith in the unseen with clarity of understanding? How do we walk the middle path between open-mindedness and critical wisdom? To unravel this, we must look to the very heart of Buddhist insight, and the delicate art of neither clinging to nor rejecting what arises. In every generation, the human mind has gazed toward the unknown, seeking answers in the stars, in sacred texts, in whispers from the unseen. And while ancient seekers turned to monasteries and mountain caves, modern seekers look to both temples and laboratories, to meditation halls and to brain scans. Today, we find ourselves standing at a fascinating crossroads, where ancient wisdom meets modern inquiry, where faith in the invisible walks hand in hand with the discipline of reason. And it is here, at this intersection, that the question quietly rises. How do we integrate spiritual phenomena into a life guided by clarity and wisdom, without falling into superstition or cold skepticism? For many modern practitioners, the challenge isn't whether spiritual experiences exist, but how to relate to them. You see, we live in an age where science has mapped the neural patterns of meditation, measured the effects of chanting on the nervous system, and even explored near-death experiences. And yet, for all our data, there remain those moments that no scan can explain. The sudden sense of presence when alone, the vivid dream that seems to carry a message, the unshakable intuition that something unseen is near. Are these mere tricks of the mind, or glimpses into deeper realities? The Buddha offered a wise and timeless response. Don't rush to believe and don't rush to deny. Observe, investigate, see how it shapes the heart. In modern Buddhist communities, many teachers advise a balanced approach. Yes, honor what you experience. If a vision appears during deep meditation, acknowledge it. If a powerful dream stirs your soul, reflect on it. But here's the key. Don't cling to it. Don't build your practice around chasing such experiences. Use them as moments to deepen inquiry. Ask yourself, does this experience reduce my greed, hatred, and delusion? Does it increase my compassion, wisdom, and equanimity? If it does, let it be a gentle teacher. If it doesn't, let it pass. Interestingly, modern psychology echoes this. Many mental health practitioners acknowledge the value of meaningful experiences, even those that defy explanation. What matters is not the event itself, but its effect on the mind. If belief in a protective spirit makes a person less fearful and more loving, it serves a purpose. If a dream prompts someone to resolve an old grudge or live more mindfully, it carries value. The danger arises only when these experiences replace rational thinking, foster unhealthy attachment, or justify harmful behavior. And so, the art lies in integrating the spiritual and the rational, not as enemies, but as complementary tools. The Buddha's teaching was never meant to be a denial of mystery. He didn't dismiss the unseen, nor did he worship it. He simply pointed to a higher priority, the end of suffering, the liberation of the heart. And if a spiritual experience helps loosen the chains of ego and illusion, it is to be welcomed. But if it binds you tighter in fear, pride, or craving, it's a chain, no matter how golden. There's a beautiful teaching from a modern Thai forest monk. A young disciple asked, "Master, what should I do if I see spirits while meditating?" The old monk smiled and said, "If they come, let them come. If they go, let them go. Don't grasp, don't push away, just know." This is the essence of integrating spiritual phenomena with rational practice. You neither deny nor obsess. You neither run toward nor away. You simply witness with clarity. In this way, the modern practitioner can walk a middle path, one foot rooted in the insights of science and reason, the other foot firmly planted in ancient wisdom, both working together not to explain away mystery, but to relate to it skillfully. Because some truths may forever elude measurement, and some mysteries are meant not to be solved, but to be honored. And so, we come to a deeper understanding. It's not a question of whether you should believe in spiritual phenomena. It's a question of how you hold that belief, lightly, wisely, with eyes open to both the seen and unseen, with a heart rooted in kindness and a mind grounded in discernment. As we near the end of this journey, one final reflection awaits us: the age-old wisdom of balancing faith with inquiry. In every era, humanity has wrestled with the invisible. We've gazed into the night sky and wondered who might be watching. We've heard whispers in the forest and questioned whether they were echoes of another world. And in the silent chambers of our hearts, we've sensed forces we cannot name. But if this journey has shown us anything, it is this: the value of a spiritual experience lies not in its spectacle, but in its capacity to transform the heart. Buddhism has never asked us to blindly believe, nor has it demanded that we reject the unseen. It simply invites us to look deeply, to see how any belief, whether in spirits, past lives, visions, or dreams, affects the mind. Does it free us from fear? Does it loosen our attachment? Does it stir the heart toward greater kindness? Or does it trap us deeper in craving and illusion? This is the measure. And so we learn to walk the middle path, not the cold denial of mystery, nor the reckless clinging to it, but a way of wisdom, a way of compassion. We allow the strange and beautiful experiences of life to arise and pass without grasping, without fear, without obsession. We use them as teachers, as mirrors showing the landscape of our own mind. And we remember, the ultimate goal was never to believe more. It was always to suffer less, to wake up, to love deeper, to live with an open heart in a fleeting world. There's an old saying among forest monks: don't waste time chasing spirits, chase your own defilements. They're the ones that steal your peace. And perhaps that is the true miracle, not visions in the night, not voices from beyond, but the quiet courage to face ourselves, to soften our anger, to release our attachments, to choose compassion over pride. That is a spiritual act. That is a path worth walking. As this journey comes to a close, may you carry these reflections with you, not as heavy beliefs, but as light lanterns on your path. May you honor mystery, but never be enslaved by it. May you open to the unseen, but never forget the suffering right before your eyes. And may you always remember, the greatest miracle is a heart awakened. If this reflection stirred something within you, if you found a moment of peace, insight, or inspiration, I invite you to journey deeper with us. Subscribe to this channel, not just to hear more stories, but to walk a path together, to share ancient wisdom, quiet reflections, and practical ways to live with compassion in a restless world. And if you know someone whose heart might be aching for meaning, peace, or clarity, share this video with them. Because wisdom is one of the few things that grows greater the more it's shared. Thank you for being here, traveler of the unseen. May your path be kind, may your heart be free, and may we meet